In 1200, and across the vast expanse of West Africa, a dramatic transformation is unfolding. For over 4 centuries, the mighty kingdom of Ghana, known to its people as Ouagadougou, had dominated the region like a colossus. But now, this once invincible empire is crumbling, and from its ashes, ambitious new powers are rising. The foundation of West African wealth lay in one of history's most profitable relationships, the trade between salt and gold. In the scorching mines of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara desert, workers extracted slabs of salt worth their weight in treasure to the farming communities of the south. Meanwhile, in the rivers and hills of Bambouk and Bure, skilled miners pulled golden metal from the earth that northern merchants desperately craved. Neither region could survive without the other. The Sahara produced no gold. The forest regions produced no salt. Nature had created the perfect conditions for commerce, and whoever controlled this exchange would determine which kingdoms rose to greatness and which faded into obscurity. Ghana had mastered this art for centuries. Positioned perfectly as the middleman, every caravan paid taxes, every merchant paid fees, and every gram of gold contributed to the royal treasury. The capital, Kumbi Saleh, was a marvel. 2 cities in one, where Arab merchants conducted business alongside traditional African courts. The king held audiences surrounded by horses draped in gold cloth and dogs wearing silver collars. But by 1200, cracks were showing. The Almoravid invasion of 1076 had disrupted the delicate balance of tolerance that made the empire work. Environmental pressures compounded the problems. Devastating droughts forced massive population movements and sparked conflicts between farming and herding communities. The economic surplus that had supported Ghana's complex political structure was disappearing, and provincial governors began acting independently. As the great empire fragmented, the stage was set for someone new to emerge, someone who could unite the chaos and create something even greater than what had come before. In the small kingdom of Kangaba, nestled in what is now the border region between Mali and Guinea, lived a people who would change the course of African history, the Mandinka. Unlike their neighbors who had been devastated by Ghana's collapse and the Almoravid invasions, the Mandinka had maintained their independence while carefully observing the rise and fall of surrounding powers. The Mandinka possessed something special, a social structure that balanced stability with flexibility. Their society was organized around extended family groups called clans, each with specific roles that contributed to the community's welfare. Skilled artisans known as Nyamakala, blacksmiths, leather workers, and musicians held special status as masters of essential crafts. But perhaps most importantly, they had the griots, professional historians and musicians who served as living libraries, preserving oral traditions and acting as diplomats between different groups. What set the Mandinka apart was their adaptability. They had embraced useful Islamic practices without abandoning traditional beliefs central to their identity. They participated in regional trade networks without becoming dependent on them. They had learned from both the successes and failures of their neighbors, developing diplomatic skills that emphasized alliance building over pure conquest. But this peaceful existence was about to be shattered. The Soso kingdom, under the iron-fisted rule of King Sumanguru, was expanding aggressively across the region. Unlike previous powers that ruled through accommodation, Sumanguru believed in conquest through superior military force and direct subjugation. The Soso had developed advanced metallurgical techniques, producing iron weapons that gave them significant military advantages. Sumanguru himself was said to be a master of both metallurgy and magic, wielding weapons that could cut through any armor. Whether supernatural or not, the Soso certainly possessed iron-working technology that provided genuine tactical advantages. Sumanguru's approach was fundamentally different from Ghana's inclusive model. The Soso ruled through fear and exploitation, replacing local rulers with Soso governors, suppressing traditional practices and imposing crushing tribute payments. This harsh method generated widespread resentment, and from that resentment would emerge a leader destined for greatness. His name was Sundiata Keita, and according to the griots, he would transform from a disabled child dismissed by many as unsuitable for leadership into the founder of the greatest empire medieval Africa had ever seen. The story of Sundiata Keita reads like legend, but within its verses lies the constitutional foundation of what would become medieval Africa's greatest power. Born with physical disabilities that prevented him from walking normally, the young prince was initially dismissed by many as unsuitable for leadership. But when Soso armies invaded Kangaba around 1235, this apparent weakness would transform into the empire's greatest strength. The invasion devastated Kangaba, driving the royal family into exile. During his years in exile, Sundiata accomplished what no previous leader had managed. He built alliances that transcended traditional boundaries of clan, kingdom, and ethnicity. Traveling throughout the region, he sought support not just through promises of military assistance, but by offering something far more valuable: a vision of shared governance that would protect local autonomy while creating unprecedented collective strength. This political philosophy became known as the Mandan Charter, or Kurukan Fuga, an oral constitution that was revolutionary for its time. It guaranteed basic rights for all people, regardless of social status, protected women's property rights, and established mechanisms for resolving conflicts without warfare. Perhaps most remarkably, it included environmental protections that reflected sophisticated understanding of sustainable resource management. The alliance that formed around Sundiata's leadership reflected these inclusive principles. Traditional Mandinka clans provided the core support, but the coalition soon included Fulani pastoralists, Soninka merchants, Susu farmers, and even disillusioned Soso nobles. Each group brought specific skills while maintaining their cultural identity within the larger framework. The decisive confrontation came at Kirina in 1235. The battle was as much a clash of political philosophies as military strategies. Sumanguru represented the old way of ruling through individual power and technological superiority. Sundiata embodied a new approach based on collective action and inclusive institutions. According to the epic traditions, the turning point came when Sundiata demonstrated that his enemy's power was not truly supernatural. Whether through superior intelligence about Soso metallurgy or genuine mystical abilities, the future emperor proved that Sumanguru's weapons could be defeated through proper tactics and preparation. The victory was total and decisive, but the real achievement began after the military triumph ended. Instead of replacing Soso oppression with his own domination, Sundiata implemented the inclusive vision that had united the resistance, creating the foundation for an empire that would endure for centuries. With Sumanguru defeated and the Soso threat eliminated, Sundiata faced the monumental task of transforming a military alliance into a functioning empire. The challenge was unprecedented. How do you govern diverse populations across vast distances while maintaining the inclusive principles that had made victory possible? The solution that emerged would influence political theory throughout the medieval world. The governmental structure Sundiata created balanced central control with local autonomy in ways that prevented both fragmentation and oppression. Provincial governors appointed by the emperor managed broad policy implementation and tribute collection, but traditional rulers retained authority over local customs, religious practices, and community affairs. This dual system created multiple pathways for advancement and participation. Traditional elites who demonstrated loyalty could advance to positions in the central government. Successful officials often married into local ruling families, creating kinship ties that strengthened political bonds. Merit-based appointments allowed talented individuals from various backgrounds to rise through imperial service. The economic foundations established during this period would support expansion for centuries. Control over the Bambuk and Bure goldfields provided basic wealth, but the system went far beyond simple resource extraction. The empire's position along major trade routes generated revenue through taxation, while the government invested heavily in infrastructure that made commerce more efficient and profitable. The tribute system was carefully designed to be sustainable and fair. Different regions contributed according to their capabilities. Agricultural areas provided food and fiber. Mining regions contributed precious metals and salt. Commercial centers paid monetary taxes based on business volumes. This diversity reduced vulnerability to disruptions in any single economic sector. Military organization reflected the alliance's diverse origins. Rather than maintaining a single large army, the empire developed specialized forces adapted to different types of warfare. River fleets provided rapid transport along the Niger. Cavalry units offered mobility across open terrain, and infantry forces maintained security in settled areas. Crucially, the military incorporated soldiers from conquered territories rather than simply imposing external control. Religious policies established patterns that would characterize the empire throughout its existence. Rather than imposing uniformity, the government protected religious diversity while promoting practices that supported political unity. Traditional African beliefs flourished alongside Islamic practices, creating syncretic expressions that became distinctively characteristic of Mali's culture. By Sundiata's death around 1255, the foundations were firmly established for what would become medieval Africa's greatest power. The institutions he created proved flexible enough to govern vast territories while maintaining respect for cultural differences, a remarkable achievement that would soon be tested by even greater ambitions under his successors. In 1312, when Mansa Musa ascended to the throne of Mali, few could have predicted that his reign would transform not just his kingdom, but the entire medieval world's understanding of African wealth and sophistication. The man who would become known as the richest individual in human history inherited more than political power. He commanded an economic engine that had been generations in the making. Musa's background prepared him exceptionally well for leadership. As a member of the royal family, he had received education in both traditional governance and Islamic scholarship. His training included exposure to the complex commercial networks that generated Mali's wealth, diplomatic protocols for managing diverse populations, and strategic thinking about projecting power across vast distances. The economic foundation he inherited was staggering. The goldfields of Bambouk and Bure were producing unprecedented quantities of precious metal, while expanded mining operations had discovered new deposits throughout the territory. Agricultural productivity had increased dramatically through innovations in farming techniques and crop diversification. Manufacturing had evolved from local craft production to organized industries serving regional and international markets. But Musa's masterstroke was his decision to undertake the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. A journey carefully planned not just as religious devotion, but as a demonstration of power that would announce Mali's arrival as a major player in international affairs. Every aspect of the expedition was designed to showcase not just wealth, but the sophisticated organizational capabilities that made such an undertaking possible. The scale was unprecedented: 60,000 people, including 500 servants, carrying staffs topped with gold. The economic impact was immediate and overwhelming. When the caravan reached Cairo, the distribution of such large quantities of gold caused inflation that affected prices for over a decade. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that currency values fell by 10 to 25%, one of the most dramatic episodes of monetary inflation in medieval history. But the economic disruption was less important than the psychological impact. The demonstration of wealth on this scale forced a fundamental reassessment of Africa's place in the medieval world system. European and Middle Eastern elites, who had viewed sub-Saharan Africa as a source of raw materials, suddenly confronted evidence of sophisticated political organization and unprecedented prosperity. The diplomatic opportunities created by this dramatic entrance were skillfully exploited. Meetings with regional leaders established formal relationships that would facilitate trade for decades. Treaties provided security for merchants and pilgrims, while commercial agreements gave Mali's traders preferential access to new markets. When Musa returned from his pilgrimage, he invested the enhanced international prestige in ambitious construction projects that transformed Mali's major cities, establishing institutions and relationships that would influence the Islamic world for generations to come. The decades following Mansa Musa's pilgrimage witnessed an unprecedented flowering of urban civilization across Mali. The international attention generated by that spectacular journey had established the empire as a global power. But the true measure of its greatness lay in the sophisticated cities that emerged as centers of learning, commerce, and cultural innovation. Timbuktu transformed from a modest trading post into one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the medieval world. Located at the strategic bend of the Niger River, where the waterway curves closest to the Sahara, the city occupied an ideal position for facilitating commerce between desert and river trade networks. But geography alone cannot explain its remarkable development. The great mosque that dominated Timbuktu's skyline represented architectural innovation that combined local building traditions with techniques learned through international contact. The The distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style, characterized by wooden support beams protruding from mud brick walls and towering minarets visible for miles, became a symbol of Mali's cultural sophistication. But the mosque anchored something even more remarkable. Sankore University, an institution that grew from informal study circles into a structured center of learning that attracted students and scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. By its height, the university housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and supported scholarly communities that pushed the boundaries of knowledge in multiple fields. The library collections at Sankore represented one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the medieval world. Manuscripts were acquired through purchase, copying, and scholarly exchange networks, connecting the city to learning centers throughout the Islamic world. The collections included religious texts, but also works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, and literature. Djenne, the ancient commercial center peacefully integrated into the empire decades earlier, experienced its own renaissance. The city's great mosque, rebuilt during this period, became a masterpiece of West African Islamic architecture. Its massive mud brick walls, supported by wooden frameworks, could withstand both intense heat and torrential rains, while maintaining acoustic properties that allowed speakers to be heard throughout the structure. Djenne's textile industry became particularly renowned. Local cotton production was supplemented with imported materials to create fabrics that combined traditional patterns with international techniques. The distinctive indigo-dyed cloth produced in Djenne workshops became prestige items throughout the region. Niamey, the political capital, developed differently but was no less impressive. The city housed the administrative apparatus, managing one of the world's largest political entities. The palace complex covered several square miles, including residential quarters, government offices, audience halls, and ceremonial spaces that projected imperial power while accommodating Mali's diverse populations. These great cities became melting pots where African traditions merged with Islamic scholarship and international commerce. Students from across the known world studied alongside local scholars. Merchants from distant lands conducted business in standardized markets, and cultural innovations emerged from the creative synthesis of different traditions. The urban civilization that flourished during this period represented one of the highest achievements of medieval African society, proof that the continent could compete with the greatest centers of learning and culture anywhere in the world. Mali's greatest achievement wasn't just its wealth or military power. It was creating a governmental system sophisticated enough to unite dozens of different ethnic groups across continental distances, while maintaining political flexibility and cultural tolerance. This wasn't merely conquest, it was the art of inclusive governance perfected. The provincial administration that evolved balanced central control with local autonomy in ways modern political scientists still study. Governors appointed by the Mansa were responsible for implementing broad imperial policies and collecting tribute, but they worked alongside traditional rulers who retained authority over local customs, religious practices, and community affairs. This dual system prevented the center from becoming overwhelmed with local details while ensuring imperial policies were adapted to regional conditions. The tribute system reflected sophisticated understanding of economic diversity. Agricultural regions provided food supplies and fiber crops. Mining areas contributed precious metals and salt. Commercial centers paid monetary taxes based on business volumes. This approach reduced Mali's vulnerability to disruptions in any single economic sector, while ensuring steady revenue flow. Mali's social structure balanced hierarchy with remarkable mobility. The traditional caste system provided social organization, but mechanisms existed for advancement through exceptional service or achievement. The Nyamakala artisan groups, blacksmiths, leatherworkers, musicians, maintained special status while taking on new roles in the expanding empire. Women enjoyed relatively high status, owning property, engaging in long-distance commerce, and participating in political decisions. Religious policies embodied Mali's inclusive philosophy. Rather than imposing uniformity, officials actively supported diversity while promoting practices that enhanced political unity. Traditional African practices received official protection. Sacred sites were preserved, seasonal festivals incorporated into calendars, traditional priests recognized as important community leaders. Islamic practices were equally encouraged, with mosques built in major cities and Islamic scholars recruited as teachers and legal advisors. The syncretic practices that emerged became distinctively characteristic of Mali's culture. Rulers participated in both traditional ceremonies and Islamic rituals. Government policies incorporated both traditional ecological wisdom and Islamic legal principles. Cultural celebrations combined elements from multiple spiritual traditions. Educational systems balanced traditional knowledge transmission with imperial needs. Griots continued their crucial role as keepers of history and law, but their training expanded to include information about the empire's diverse populations. Islamic schools taught literacy and numeracy essential for commercial success. Craft guilds maintained technical knowledge while adapting to new technologies. Legal systems combined traditional dispute resolution with imperial standardization. Local communities retained authority over internal matters, but major crimes and inter-community disputes were handled by imperial courts applying consistent standards. Commercial law received particular attention as trade volumes increased dramatically. The currency policies reflected Mali's role as a commercial intermediary between different economic systems. Gold dust remained the standard for major transactions, while salt bars, cowrie shells, and cloth strips served specific regional markets. This monetary diversity allowed Mali to facilitate business between regions using different currency systems. This sophisticated governmental framework would be tested as Mali reached its greatest extent, governing territories from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, encompassing populations that spoke dozens of languages and practiced countless different traditions, all united under the vision of inclusive empire. The death of Mansa Musa in 1337 marked the end of an era that had seen Mali transform from a regional kingdom into a global power. His passing left behind an inheritance that was both magnificent and precarious, a vast empire that required exceptional leadership to maintain cohesion across such diverse populations and distances. The succession crises that followed revealed the first serious weakness in the governmental systems that had served so effectively during the previous century. Unlike the smooth transitions that had characterized earlier periods, the transfer of power sparked disputes that weakened central authority for decades. Multiple claimants emerged from the royal family, each supported by different factions and regional power bases throughout the territories. The traditional succession principles established by Sundiata had worked well when the royal family was relatively small and the political elite remained unified. But generations of expansion and prosperity had created a much larger royal family, with multiple branches claiming legitimate rights to rule. The wealth generated by Musa's pilgrimage had also created new centers of power that complicated traditional consensus-building processes. Regional governors, who had grown accustomed to considerable autonomy during the height of expansion, began asserting even greater independence as central authority wavered. Some declared support for particular throne claimants, while using this allegiance to justify policies serving regional rather than imperial interests. Others remained nominally loyal, while effectively governing their territories as independent kingdoms. The consequences became apparent immediately. Tax collection became irregular as provincial administrators prioritized local needs over imperial obligations. Military recruitment suffered as regional leaders retained forces for their own purposes. Commercial regulation broke down as different provinces implemented contradictory policies that disrupted trade networks. External pressures compounded these internal problems. The most serious threat came from the expanding Songhai kingdom centered around Gao, which had grown increasingly powerful under the Sunni dynasty. Songhai's challenge was both economic and political. They controlled strategic positions along the Niger River that allowed them to disrupt trade routes crucial to Mali's prosperity. Tuareg incursions intensified during this period, exploiting Mali's weakness while creating new sources of instability. These nomadic peoples formed partnerships with rebellious governors or operated independently, raiding trade routes and settlements. Their mobility and fighting skills made them particularly difficult enemies for imperial forces designed primarily for conventional warfare. Environmental pressures that had always challenged imperial administration became more severe as political instability reduced the government's capacity to respond effectively. The Sahel experienced severe droughts, during the 14th and 15th centuries that disrupted agricultural production and forced large-scale population movements. Previously, the imperial government had managed such challenges through coordinated responses, but the breakdown of central authority meant provincial administrators prioritized local needs over broader coordination. The loss of Timbuktu to Songhai forces around 1433 represented more than military defeat. It symbolized the breakdown of the imperial system that had created one of medieval Africa's greatest centers of learning and commerce. The fall of such an important city demonstrated that the imperial government could no longer protect its most valuable assets, encouraging other regions to seek accommodation with rising powers rather than remaining loyal to a weakening center. When Sunni Ali Bur ascended to leadership of the Songhai Kingdom in 1464, he possessed both the military genius and political vision necessary to complete the destruction of Mali's fragmenting imperial system. Unlike previous challengers who had merely nibbled at the edges of imperial territory, this formidable ruler launched a systematic campaign to capture the core cities that remained the symbolic and economic heart of the weakened empire. Timbuktu fell to Songhai siege in 1468, marking the beginning of the end for any hope of Mali's revival. While the city had already changed hands multiple times during previous decades of instability, this conquest was different in both scale and finality. Scholarly communities that had made the city famous fled, taking with them manuscripts and knowledge that represented centuries of intellectual achievement. Djenne succumbed in 1473 after a prolonged siege that demonstrated both Songhai military effectiveness and the weakness of remaining imperial forces. The loss of this ancient commercial center, with its textile industry and role as a trade hub, deprived Mali of crucial economic resources while providing Songhai with the wealth necessary to fund further expansion. The final imperial rulers found themselves fighting a losing battle against forces that were better organized, more motivated, and commanded superior resources. By 1500, the last effective imperial ruler had died, marking the formal end of a political system that had governed much of West Africa for over 2 centuries. But the political death of Mali did not mean the disappearance of its cultural and intellectual achievements. The institutions and traditions that had flourished during the height of imperial power continued to influence African societies long after the government that created them ceased to exist. Mandinka cultural identity survived the collapse of central political authority. Languages, customs, and social institutions continued to spread throughout West Africa, carried by merchants, scholars, and migrants who maintained connections to their cultural homeland. Griot traditions became even more important as political institutions disappeared, serving as living repositories of cultural memory. Islamic scholarly traditions that had flourished in imperial cities continued to influence intellectual development throughout West Africa. Scholars trained in Timbuktu, Djenne, and other centers carried their knowledge to new locations, establishing schools and libraries that maintained connections to the broader Islamic world. The manuscript traditions that had made imperial cities famous survived through preservation efforts by scholarly families and religious institutions. Thousands of manuscripts were hidden or transported to safety, maintaining collections that would eventually provide evidence of Mali's remarkable intellectual achievements to modern scholars. Commercial practices and networks adapted to new political circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics. Merchant families that had operated throughout imperial territories continued their activities under new political arrangements, preserving trading relationships and business practices proven successful over generations. Perhaps most importantly, Mali had demonstrated that African societies could create and sustain sophisticated political institutions that competed successfully on the international stage while maintaining distinctive cultural identities. The empire's achievements in governance, education, commerce, and culture provided evidence of African capabilities that challenged racist assumptions about the continent and its peoples. The legacy continues to inspire contemporary African political thought and Pan-African identity, proving that Africa's current challenges don't reflect inherent limitations, but rather the consequences of external exploitation and internal conflicts that can be overcome. Mali's story remains not just ancient history, but living inspiration for realizing Africa's full potential in the modern world.